Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining today eBay's Government Relations EU webinar on VAT and Brexit. Today, together with a couple of colleagues and one external speaker, we'll be going through the main burning issues that we find at the moment, which are VAT and Brexit. Our panelists today are going to be Stefan Kraucik, who is our Associate General Counsel, Head of eBay's Government Relations Team for EMEA. Myself, Georgiana, I'm heading the Small Business Advocacy Team. Anita, who is our Global Head of Indirect Tax at eBay. Michaela, who is our Director Indirect Tax at eBay. And our external speaker, William Bain, who is part of the British Retail Consortium, who will be actually addressing the Brexit part of our webinar. I will first walk you through our Zoom capabilities. Afterwards, we will be giving you an eBay update. Followed by the presentation from our tax team. We will move on to Brexit and we will end with the questions and answer session. As you will probably notice, you will be able to see and hear us. Unfortunately, we will not be able to hear you, but you can easily connect to us through our Q&A function. Please feel free to address any questions you might have using this Q&A function. If you're calling in, please make sure that you email us. Our email address is government_relations@ebay.com. We will try to answer as many questions as we can. Should there be any questions that remain unanswered, we will get back to you after we will close our webinar. I will hand now over to our colleague who is heading the government relations team here in EMEA, Stefan Kraucik. Stefan?
Yes, hello, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome. I'm extremely pleased to see that we're already over 51 participants. I would like to, first of all, thank William and Anita. William, thanks for joining us from the British Retail Consortium. Extremely pleased to have you there and very much looking forward to your view on Brexit. Anita, my dear colleague from the United States, I would like to specifically thank her because it is very early in the morning where she is. Anita is heading our tax team globally. She is a very important colleague for us when we do our government relations job. And that's the one key point I wanted to make today before we go into the thick of it with the issues today. At eBay in EMEA, we have a small but a very active team of government relations people. Four of us in Brussels, including Georgiana, Charlotte, and Denisa. We have Alistair McGowan in London, who is covering the UK and Ireland, and of course is working also with people like William, with the UK government. We have Nicolaus, who is based in Berlin, and who covers a big part also of Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. And then we have Chantal in Amsterdam, who covers major parts of Northern Europe. And all of us are very focused on the two issues and have been for a long time on the two issues that are on the agenda today. Value-added tax with the VAT package that was adopted in the EU not so long ago, and Brexit, of course. And the let's say, common thread through all of this is that as eBay, obviously we're a big platform and we have our own platform specific, corporate specific topics that we deal with as well. But first and foremost, we see it as our job in government relations at eBay to represent the interest of our sellers, obviously also of our buyers, but in terms of legislation that's been coming at us in the last couple of years, the focus has really very much been on the sellers and all the challenges that they face in their daily work. And of course, value-added tax with the huge administrative burden that it puts on companies, in particular in cross-border trade. The fact that there are some new approaches being introduced, starting with Australia and now coming to Europe with the low value import threshold abolished, and marketplaces like us being asked to collect and remit VAT, making things maybe easier for VAT authorities, but far more complex for us in the e-commerce world, and putting a burden on cross-border trade, not to mention the low value thresholds inside the EU between member states. And then, of course, in a way, somehow related to that, but much, much broader and even more complex, is obviously life after Brexit. How will that look for you as our sellers, in terms of selling to the UK or buying from the UK? That smooth cross-border trade that we've had until now. So two key topics for us as eBay Government Relations. We're extremely pleased that quite a few of you who are now already over 60 participants of eBay users, sellers, are often very actively helping us in our government relations, which we are very grateful for, because if we win together, and it's a win-win situation for both of us. So I wish you a great webinar with my colleagues and with William Bay. Thank you.
Anita, I will move on to you so you can start already the conversation on VAT.
Thank you, Georgiana and Stefan. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm just going to walk you through kind of an overall global landscape with where we are with VAT as it relates to marketplaces. So, Georgiana, if you don't mind, thank you. Great. And just kind of, I want to focus macro, and then we'll like zone into Europe. And Michaela, who's on my team and heads up EMEA Indirect Taxes, will dive deeper into what that means. But from a global perspective, as Stefan mentioned, we are seeing the world of indirect taxes evolve. Now, in Europe, VAT is something that everybody is quite familiar with, and it's not a new concept. Across the world, we are seeing more and more countries introduce regimes like a VAT, and not only are they introducing it, they are placing the collection and the remittance burden on marketplaces. So if you kind of go back with your experience on eBay, many of you may get charged VAT on your sell fees, and I don't think that's going to go away, unfortunately. But in addition to that, we've seen regimes like the JSL, where tax authorities are holding eBay jointly responsible for the VAT on the goods that is being sold on the platform. And then there's a new flavor to that, which is what we're calling here collect and remit. But what that means is tax authorities are placing a burden on the marketplace and taking it away from the sellers to collect the VAT or sales tax on the actual goods that are being sold on the platform into their country. So Australia kicked this off in July 2018. So any goods that are sold from outside Australia into Australia, eBay would charge GST at checkout, collect that amount from the buyer, and remit it to the tax authorities. Soon after that, the US followed, and unlike Australia, even the US is one, I think some of you are saying you can't hear me. Is this better? Okay, let me know if it isn't. Okay, great. The US followed, and unlike Australia, even though it's one country, they did it state by state. Now, what we've learned from that experience, we can actually leverage in Europe, because although Europe and the EU is, the law will be applicable as one, every country will have its nuances. So in the US, we are now over 90% of states where if you ship an item into a certain state, eBay will be responsible for collecting the sales tax on the actual item. As we know, the EU Commission had proposed a similar type of regime starting January 1 of 2021, but it appears now it's been postponed to July 2021. And of course, I know William will touch upon Brexit, but what that means for us is the UK will also have a similar type of collect and remit law where the burden will be placed on the marketplace. And unlike the European Union, they do not plan to postpone that to July 2021. So it's likely that we will go from January 1 of 2021, where eBay will have the responsibility for the VAT shipped to items into the UK. Now, Michaela will deep dive into exactly what that means. I know I gave you a lot of theory, but what does that mean and how does this apply to you as a seller and a buyer, but mainly as a seller? So let me hand over to Michaela.
Thank you very much, Anita, and welcome also from my side to this webcast. So thanks, Jana. So today we will spend a little time on the new VAT rules for e-commerce to be introduced in the European Union. So the European Union intends, like Stefan already outlined, to modernize and simplify the VAT system for online sales of goods and aim at combating fraud by placing a higher burden on marketplaces. So what are the new rules and what does it actually mean? These are very technical changes with a lot of detail, but let's focus on the key highlights and how this applies to eBay and its sellers. So firstly, ending low-value import VAT exemption. From 2021, the €22 VAT exemption on small parcels being imported into the EU for delivery to consumers will be abolished. The implication of that with effect of the new regulations is that VAT must be charged for all consignments imported into the EU at the point of sale not exceeding €150. Secondly, marketplaces become the deemed reseller with the obligation to collect and remit the VAT to the local tax authority in certain cases. The new deemed reseller regime will apply in two use cases. So when goods are imported into the EU with the value not exceeding €150, so for example, let's assume there's a pair of shoes being sold from a Chinese seller, ultimately bought by a German buyer for €100. In this case, the marketplace will be the deemed reseller and has to charge German VAT to the buyer as the goods are being shipped to Germany. When the goods enter Germany, no additional import VAT should be charged at the German border. And sales within the EU from a non-established EU seller to consumers in the EU. Let's also make this more clear by amending the example we had before. So in this case, shoes will also be sold from a Chinese seller, but the goods are already in Germany in the warehouse of the Chinese seller. The shoes are purchased by an Austrian buyer and shipped from Germany to Austria. In this case, the marketplace will be the deemed reseller and has to charge Austrian VAT to the buyer as the shoes are shipped to Austria. In another step, the current existing distance selling threshold in the EU will be abolished and replaced with an EU-wide threshold of €10,000. Currently, the obligation to register in another EU country is dependent on the distance selling threshold in the country, either of approximately €35,000 or €100,000. So if you are an Austrian seller selling shoes to a German consumer below a €100,000, you have no obligation to register for VAT in Germany. Going forward, the country-by-country threshold will be removed and the 10,000 cross-border EU threshold has been introduced. This means, for our example, that the Austrian seller selling, for example, €5,000 to German buyers and €6,000 to Romanian buyers and exceeding the €10,000 threshold has VAT obligations in both countries. We are already in July now, and that new regulation should have come into effect from 1st January 2021, as Anita already mentioned. But on 8 May 2020, because of practical difficulties created by the coronavirus pandemic, the Commission proposed to postpone the introduction of the new e-commerce VAT rules by 6 months. The 6 months deferral has, in the meanwhile, been politically agreed, and the implementation be postponed until the 1st July 2021. So the Council will adopt that, and I think there will be definitely the postponement. So That is all from my side. And now going back to Anita to the next slide to dig deeper into the impacts for buyers and sellers.
So I see there are a lot of questions about how this will work if you're a seller, or what does this mean for VAT? And I'll start with the caveat that we're still working out the exact details of how this is going to apply on the site and how this is going to impact your experience. But we do know certain things for sure, and they are for the buyers, if there is items coming into your country from outside the European Union or outside the UK, if you're in UK, then most likely your item will have a VAT calculated on it by eBay and added to your item price at checkout. And we will do this based on the item and the shipping address. So as a buyer, there isn't much that you can do in the sense that what you will be paying will include VAT. And I know there are some questions about how can we avoid double taxation, and we are working with the customs authorities around the European Union and the UK to make sure that those packages have certain labels on it to make, to highlight that VAT has already been paid by the buyer and eBay has collected it. So that is something we are working with them, and we have done this in other countries like Norway that went live last year. Now, from a seller perspective, I think the main thing that you have to remember is your item price, even though you list it for a certain amount, is going to change at checkout depending on where the buyer is. So you need to keep that in mind when pricing your items, because you could have quite a range of VAT added to it at checkout. Also, I think individually for a European seller, the turnover, as Michaela mentioned, is going to change. So you may need to register or have a VAT obligation in countries that you did not previously have. So you do need to look at how that's going to impact your business and what compliance steps you need to take to make sure that you're meeting your obligations in various countries. Again, we've kept it pretty high level because I think it's dependent country by country, and it's also dependent on exactly how each country is going to roll out these legislations. And given that there is a postponement, we will have further details in a few months from now when we will be able to show you what the exact experience is on eBay. And I know there will be a lot of communication to our seller community as to the steps that are needed to take and what kind of material you can leverage from eBay to make sure that this is a smooth transition. So I think that's all for now. Please keep asking your questions and we can answer some of them at the end of this webinar. Thanks, Georgiana.
Thank you, Anita. Thank you very much, Michaela. Now we will move on to the second topic of today. We will start with William giving a short presentation on Brexit and what's going to happen in the upcoming months and maybe a year from now.
Thanks, Georgiana. Welcome, everyone. Delighted to see so many people taking part in this webinar today. And I hope both topics will be of great interest and relevance to all of you. In my presentation, I want to cover what we know are going to be the consequences for VAT on goods transactions at the end of the transition period, which, given that the deadline for an extension has now passed, is now going to be at midnight on the 31st of December, midnight CET. So from the 1st of January, there will be a new system in operation in any cross-border supply of goods involved between the EU and Great Britain. So let's first of all, I think, just define what leaving the transition period is going to mean. A hugely significant change. It will be the first time in some 48 years that the UK will not have been part of the common VAT area with the EU. So there is considerable regulatory change involved as a result of that. The UK is going to retain VAT as a tax on the supply of goods and services. It introduced this when it was entering the EU in the early 1970s. Previously, the UK had a general sales tax, but it will retain VAT as its leading tax on supply of goods and services. And this will also include online purchases. You do hear at the moment a lot of talk about having separate online taxes, but for the moment, at least, the UK is not going down that route. Now, the key difference between the system we've had for 48 years and what will happen on the 1st of January is that goods moving between the EU and Great Britain, very different rules for Northern Ireland, which I'll touch upon in my remarks. So EU GB movements cease to be intra-union supplies of goods, and they become imports and exports instead. And that means that import VAT is involved as a result. And also, because of the timing of the end of the transition period, the UK will not have a distance sales regime under EU law applicable from the 1st of January 2021. So that's another factor that's got to be taken into account. The likely scope of the relationship between the EU and the UK on VAT is really similar to that between the EU and Norway. So there will be very limited use of databases, things like OS. Someone who's VAT registered in the UK will not be able to use OS. Be very limited access to VEs, simply for prevention of crime, detection of fraud, tackling crime. So it will have cooperation, but really just at governmental level on averting crime. So the UK will have a very different relationship to the EU VAT area than it's had for almost the last half a century. And as I said just a minute ago, GB companies, unless they're VAT registered in the EU or part of a group which is registered in the EU, will move out of being able to use OS. That will stop at the end of this year. Also, leaving the common VAT area means it will get harder to claim VAT refunds on cross-border transactions. So instead of the current system, which works well, for UK companies, it would revert to the paper-based system under the 13th VAT directive. So a lot more red tape, time, expense involved in getting VAT refunds. On the next slide, I think we've skipped on one extra slide, so just back to the previous one. Yeah, so the UK is going to remain a single VAT area in theory. And the rates of VAT will be set by the UK Parliament. How the revenue is apportioned will be a matter for the UK Parliament. Some of the other rules around VAT, they will be set by the UK Parliament. It is not what we call a devolved tax, where Northern Ireland, Scotland or Wales have any particular powers. So there will be a sort of clear setting of rules by the Westminster Parliament. But however, Northern Ireland, through the operation of the protocol in the withdrawal agreement, is internally going to apply EU law in relation to VAT on goods transactions. Now we have a bit of a sort of split going to happen, because if there's any services involved in your transaction, and that is becoming a big part of commerce these days. You might have a fridge which has an online component and speaks to the manufacturer. There are going to be many more smart devices as this decade goes on. So the services component of any transaction that involves Northern Ireland will be set by UK law. So you are going to have this split in Northern Ireland between VAT on goods, which will be regulated by European Union rules, and VAT on services, which will be regulated by UK rules. So there is likely that we are going to have incidents of greater complexity and confusion for sales involving Northern Ireland. Now, goods transactions from Great Britain to Northern Ireland will be treated as imports and exports as well. So on arrival at the Northern Ireland border, there will be an import VAT chargeable event as a result. We don't know as yet what the UK government is planning to do in terms of Northern Ireland to GB sales. They have pledged unfettered access of NI goods to the GB market. So they may simply not do any checks. They may claim it's not a chargeable event in terms of VAT. But the situation is not resolved yet. And the Joint Committee and the Specialised Committee under the Withdrawal Agreement have to iron this out really by the end of the year. Now, goods transactions between the EU and Northern Ireland and the EU will be treated as intra-union supplies. So there is no charge to import VAT involved. Northern Ireland will be treated as if it were part of the common VAT area for transactions involving goods, but not for services. In which case, if you have a service, that will involve a cross-border import VAT charge. Now, if we look at the next slide, what we've done with this is really to try and put together the different kinds of goods movements that we commonly do, and to look at what the VAT treatment is. And then we'll explore in a bit of detail some of the implications of all of this. So goods moving from Great Britain to the European Union will be treated as a VAT import in the member state of importation. So import VAT will be chargeable in the member state in which the goods arrive. Similarly, goods moving from the European Union to Great Britain will be an export from the member state concerned, and import VAT will be chargeable in terms of the United Kingdom when goods arrive in Great Britain. As we said, goods from Great Britain to Northern Ireland will again be treated as an import for VAT purposes on arrival in Northern Ireland. The tax treatment in terms of Great Britain, in terms of goods going the other way, yet to be determined. And of course, NI to EU movements will be an intra-union transfer, so there's no import VAT actionable as a result. Now on to the next slide and the next one. Yeah. So what I want to do is just to go through the different kinds of goods movements on consumer transactions and to spell out what the consequences of all of these different measures are going to be for sales which you are hoping to make. So in terms of an EU to GB business to consumer transaction and sale, then that involves import VAT in relation to Great Britain, and so the EU business should not levy VAT itself. Now, the GB arrangements are still to be confirmed in terms of how one declares or certifies the VAT. Last year, in terms of the no-deal arrangements under the Article 50 process, there was a split liability system for goods which were under or over £135 in value. If the goods were under £135 in value, then the exporting supplier had to have a UK VAT number. They had to register for an online system to account for any VAT payable to the UK government, Her Majesty's Treasury. But for goods over £135, responsibility was going to fall on the purchaser to account for the importation via a quarterly return. No payment would be required at the border in this instance. Now, one of the consequences of the UK in respect of Great Britain leaving the common VAT area is that for consumers, national postal services could collect the additional VAT which is due, but also chargeable events would occur in respect of transit costs, insurance, handling by the national postal operator, or indeed packing. So there are going to be higher VAT costs for consumers buying goods from a supplier within the European Union caused by the UK leaving the common VAT area. That is one of the inescapable consequences of what Brexit means for the sale of goods on a cross-border basis. On the next slide, we look at goods going the other way. So this is GB to EU sales. Now, here, I think the rules are somewhat clearer because this flows really from EU directives. So import VAT will be due at the point of importation into the member state of importation, unless there is a deferred accounting and payment system in operation. As we know, in some member states, this happens. Some member states do not have this. That's a member state competence. And VAT will be due on the customs value of the goods, plus any duties. So if we had a regrettable situation where there is a no deal and there are going to be tariffs due on goods, if the goods would be required to face customs duties, VAT would be due on the duties as well as the intrinsic value of the good. Plus also there will be VAT due on packing, national mail handling charges and insurance. So again, goods moving in that other direction will still in the end mean the consumer will face higher VAT than before purchasing a good from the Great Britain. Now, we know that there's an optional import scheme going to apply from the 1st of January next year within the EU for goods imported from a third country up to a value of 150 euros. And that would work through the seller collecting the VAT at the point of sale and remitting it to the member state of the consumer via OSS. And the goods are then exempt from VAT on importation into the EU. But you do need to have an intermediary in the EU for this type of process, whether that's a courier, postal services operator, or a customs agent. There is an alternative scheme that can be used. So where you cannot use import OSS, then again from the 1st of January next year, for goods under 150 euros in value, import VAT can be collected from the consumer by the courier when the goods have arrived and have been delivered. And then it can be remitted to the member state customs authorities. So those are the two ways that a business to consumer transaction between a British supplier and an EU consumer can be handled from the 1st of January. And as we know, the effect of having the small value consignment relief going is going to be quite profound as well. On the next slide, we look at what the effects are within the UK. So again, there is effectively a VAT border for goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So a GB to NI, business to consumer goods scale, will be regarded as an import and an export. The rates applicable will be the same as those affecting the supply of the same goods in Northern Ireland. Now that's quite interesting because under the protocol, there is a facility whereby if the rate of VAT is lower in the Irish Republic on a certain good, that lower rate can be applied in Northern Ireland. So although we've said, Northern Ireland is treated as being part of a UK VAT area, it could be applying rates of VAT that are applicable in the Republic of Ireland. And so you're going to have to watch if there is any difference. And I think at the moment, sanitary products are one area where there is a different rate. But as time goes on, we may see further divergence in the rates of VAT. So that's something you'll have to be aware about in terms of sending any goods to Northern Ireland. Now, the import VAT will have to be paid at the time of importation, unless there is a sort of deferred accounting system. Again, one would imagine in terms of a business to consumer transaction, the consumer might be able to pay the VAT to the national postal carrier on receipt of the goods or prepay it before the goods are delivered. So it will have to be paid by the consumer. So Royal Mail will collect VAT due from the consumer based on the intrinsic value of the goods, but also including any customs duties that would be due and additional costs such as packing, insurance, handling and transit. So again, for a GB to NI sale, the consumer is going to have to pay more than they do at the moment to receive the goods. And again, Northern Ireland consumers can make use of OSS in relation to a distance sale of goods imported from Great Britain, which have an intrinsic value of less than 150 euros. On the next slide, we deal with a Northern Ireland to EU consumer goods sale. So this is where you might have a supplier in Belfast selling to a consumer in Paris. And this would be regarded as an intra-union transfer of goods. So it's exempt from VAT in Northern Ireland. The purchasing consumer in the EU will be taxed in the member state in terms of the conditions applicable there. So whichever is the rate in France, what are any exemptions, that will be the governing legislation. Now, the Northern Ireland-based business can use OSS to declare and pay VAT in respect of any distance selling transactions for a consumer based in the EU. And they are able also to seek refunds of these VAT payments made to the EU member state, where this relates to VAT, which is paid on the prior acquisition of goods. So if you have quite a complex supply chain, you will be able to get a VAT refund in terms of your input VAT in relation to this NI-EU transaction to the consumer. And in terms of distance sales, because Northern Ireland will be applying EU legislation, then OSS can be used in distance sales as well to support any payments or remittances. And the next slide deals with goods going the other way. So European Union to Northern Ireland B2C sale. So a supplier in Vienna supplying goods to a customer in Strabane, Northern Ireland. It's an intra-union transfer as far as the protocol and EU law are concerned. It's exempt from VAT in the member state. The purchasing customer in Northern Ireland will be taxed there in respect of the applicable Northern Ireland rates. So subject to that proviso that I mentioned earlier, that you may have over time Northern Ireland applying lower Republic of Ireland VAT rates on goods. So that's something we've got to watch for. And in respect of distance sales, then yes, OSS can be used in terms of the member state for a Northern Ireland bound distance sale. So as you can see, there's going to be an enormous amount of extra complexity involved through Great Britain leaving this common VAT area. And I would urge all retailers working with eBay very closely, but also to look at the VAT pages on the Commission website, which have some very good information on the things you'll have to do in order to make cross-border transactions with both Great Britain and with Northern Ireland.
Thank you so much, William. Extremely useful information. Sorry, I think you still have.
Yeah, just a very few conclusions, just to finish up. Very lot of information there. Get ready for more complexity. As we know, VAT law is changing rapidly in the EU. Lots of new measures coming in. So this is going to add to that complexity. So you've got to be aware of it and make sure you're getting the best advice from eBay and applying the right rules in the right transaction. Bear in mind there'll be different sets of rules which will apply depending where you send the goods from and what the destination will be, the sort of Great Britain, Northern Ireland split. Remember what the loss of the small value consignment relief is going to mean in terms of goods you might be sending, a CD or a Blu-ray that's maybe worth less than 22 euros. Remember that the consumer ultimately is going to pay the extra price from this. And so that's something you may want to consider in terms of marketing and pricing strategies Will the consumer be more reluctant to make as many sales as they have with all of these perhaps hidden costs coming in for a cross-border transaction? And also, I think to just take the best advice possible in terms of where you're supplying the goods to, given this complex system of VAT, which is going to apply in Northern Ireland, the split between the goods set by the EU and services set by the UK.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Extremely useful conclusions and extremely good advice for our sellers. Now we will move to the Q&A part. We have received quite a big amount of questions. My colleagues have already, and William have already answered quite a few of them. I will move now to Christiana, who will be still reading a few questions, even some of them that have been answered in private, because I think some of them are asking quite interesting ideas that the rest of our sellers should actually hear of here as well. Christiana?
Perfect. Thanks, Georgie. First and foremost, a couple of questions we got were regarding access to the presentation, and we just want to make sure that everyone knows that this presentation, this webinar, is being recorded and will be uploaded to our eBay Main Street page. We expect that it'll be uploaded and ready to view and share early next week. So for any reason, if you wish to share this information or go back and review it, you can do so on our Main Street page. Perfect. So to start off, I see a question that's for Michaela, actually. So a seller has asked that basically they must have a VAT number in the country where they keep their items and ship items from. Is that correct, or is that different?
That is correct. That is correct. So they have to keep a VAT number in the country where they're shipping from.
Perfect. And then can you also kind of elaborate? So eBay allows VAT exemption, is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Perfect. Let's move on to the next question. William, I think this is a good question for you. So can you go a little bit more in depth? I think you answered it already, but how is selling going to change after Brexit, especially as a UK, if that's a big customer, if you could just review that a little bit more.
Yes, that's right. I mean, we went through just the detail about how much on the VAT side things are going to change, but there's potentially going to be a lot of other changes as well. I mean, if there is not a zero tariff, zero quotas deal agreed from these negotiations, there may well be customs duties that would apply. There will be customs declarations that have to be made, entry and exit summary declarations under EU law. There may also be, depending on the goods, safety and security permits required as well. So there's going to be a great deal of additional red tape as a result of the disentangling of the relationship between Great Britain and the European Union. And in a sense, the transition period masks that, but it took many years for businesses to get ready for the single market and the removal of non-tariff barriers and customs duties between different countries. And we're perhaps going to see some of those barriers put back up, all within the space of the next 6 months. So the changes are going to be very, very profound indeed. And that's why you have to keep speaking and getting the best advice from eBay, and also going on to the European Commission website to look at all the practical steps you can take now and you should take before January.
Going off of that, William, I think this might be another question for you. So we have a question from a seller who has their products located in the EU but outside of the UK. They are a VAT payer in their country and their VAT is attached to eBay, but they are selling a lot of products to the UK. Do they also need UK VAT as well, or no?
The answer at the moment is we're not sure. We are likely in the middle of this month to have the publication by the UK government of its border operating model, which should give answers to how it proposes to operate its tax and customs and regulatory border with the European Union, with or without a deal. And remember, on VAT, the difference between a deal scenario and a no deal scenario is going to be very, very slight. Automatically, by leaving the common VAT area and the jurisdiction of the directives and the European Court of Justice, massive changes of the sort we've described happen. And nothing in terms of the red lines in the negotiations are going to restore Great Britain to the common VAT area. So this would be a decision, really, I think, for the UK government in terms of Great Britain as to whether they will go back to the scheme that they had last year, whereby if you had goods worth under £135, you used an online system. This we don't know the answer to, but we may well do by the middle of this month.
Perfect. Okay, I think the next question, maybe Anitha or Michaela, this is kind of one that you guys can take. Can you go over a little bit more in depth? We have a couple of questions around how eBay is charging VAT. If you could just go over that process a little bit, I think that might clear some things up for some sellers.
Sure, how we're charging VAT or GST if this was to come into place. I'm going to assume that's the question. How would we do that? So we would look at a couple of different factors. Obviously, what the item is, where the item is being shipped to, and in some cases, who is shipping the item. And we do have a tax engine, and we have logic built in to our checkout flow that will take these different attributes and determine the VAT rate based on the country and if the item is exempt or reduced or not. I mean, that's a high level flow of how we would do that.
Perfect. And then a follow-up question for Anitha. How are sellers supposed to declare that the tax has already been paid on packages when shipping so that buyers do not have to pay VAT twice?
I think this is a good question, and I mentioned it earlier that eBay will be working with the tax authorities, and we are getting different shipping labels that sellers would need to attach to their packages so that when they go through the different borders, it's not going to be stopped at customs and the buyer does not have to pay the VAT amount again as it's already been collected at checkout.
Perfect.
But I think this is definitely one that is work in progress. Every customs and postal authority has a slightly different take and a different view on it. So more to come as the months go on.
Awesome. And then I think this next question can kind of be just a free flow question for anyone who wants to provide some insight or some help. Do you guys have or know of any resources, pages, or sites where sellers can keep up to date on, this ever-changing issue regarding Brexit and VAT, or places that they can get support and ask questions? If anyone knows of any that they can offer, that would be, I think, very helpful to our sellers.
Yes, so today you can go on the European Commission website and look at the end of transition period site that they have there. And there is I think it's right at the bottom of the page, there is a very good document they have on VAT. And you can find more details there about all these different, where you're sending the goods and what the implications are. So that's there already. And my understanding is the UK government are going to, from the middle of this month, start producing similar readiness notices in terms of goods coming into Great Britain and to Northern Ireland. So you can look at the European Commission page on Readiness Now and the UK government pages for the best advice from the middle of this month.
Perfect, very helpful. So yeah, I think that is enough time for Q&A. However, I'm going to turn it back over to Georgie, but before we do, we just want to stress that if you have any follow-up questions, or if you asked a question that you think feel wasn't answered well enough, we have provided our government relations email. Feel free to follow up with questions there and send them that way. Georgie?
Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Thank you very much to all our panelists for your extremely useful input and information. Like Christiana said, should you have any more questions, please feel free to reach out to us at government_relations@ebay.com. We will do our best to answer most of your questions. In case we see there's going to be a lot of interest in these topics, we are happy to do a follow-up webinar. So please feel free to reach out to us, and we will try to make sure that we will get back to you with more useful information in the upcoming months. Thank you very much, everybody.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.